Hello there. So we are recording our second episode. We are still with Ivan. So thanks again for returning, Ivan. We will. I think we still have a lot to cover.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me back, and I look forward to getting into it.
Nice. So let's start easy. Maybe try to return to the terminal a little bit. So we talked about that in our last episode, and you mentioned that you were using some Linux, command line tool to help you grab the important piece that you are receiving. My issues that I have is that when you don't really know what column exactly you need, and especially if you are reading some kind of a huge blob of logs, for example, with lots of GUID and things like that. So when I started using screen reader, I realized how much GUID are so verbose when you are trying to make sense of a huge blob of text.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting problems there we can unpack. So I'll sort of work backwards. The verbosity of logs and the GUIDs and the IDs that will show up maybe as trace data in a log that are going to be in every message, and sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're not. Sometimes you want to correlate log output based on matching that ID, but sometimes you don't care. It can be involved to distill that stuff down into what you are interested in. And I've used the tools that you were referring to from our last episode were me referencing using things like cut and awk and sed and whatnot to try to chop up my terminal output into the section of, in this case, we're talking about columns. So the section of columns that I'm most interested in. With logs, it can be challenging and a bit case by case, but what I would tend to do in those situations is sometimes I would pipe the logs I was looking at through something like sed or Perl. I used to be a big Perl person.
Nice.
So shout out to all my non-Perl haters in the world. And I would pipe those logs through something that would allow me to match something by regular expression and then maybe do a substitution to nothing. So if there's a pattern to those GUIDs, for example, it's a GUID equals a bunch of text followed by a space or followed by a closed parentheses, I would temporarily factor that out. Similarly, sometimes I want to see logs, but I don't want to see all of the timestamp stuff that comes before it and all of the boilerplate that, let's say we're looking at a syslog file from a Linux box, right? I would sometimes use something like the cut command and say, I only want to see from character 32 or 56 or whatever onward. And so it's essentially like, show me the logs from sort of the middle out to the right only. And this is purely temporary and in service of me getting to see the meat of what happened in the log, not March 31st, 2025, 1325, blah, 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 bracket, the name of some daemon, close bracket, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those kind of things can help. Of course, the more distributed a system becomes, an application, a series of applications, we're not just running an app on one server or two servers. Logs also become distributed. And I won't go down the rabbit hole on this too much, but it's an interesting problem to think about logs existing in a whole different system. Using something like, I'll pick on Datadog, but it could be anything. Using a system where logs are in a UI instead of as manipulatable because they're coming from files and so on. It's a whole different problem.
Yeah.
Admittedly, that's a problem that is less solved for me, and a lot of these observability / log aggregation tracing type systems are not nearly as accessible as I think that they should be. So that's a whole nother interesting problem, and I'd love to work with some of these companies more to try to change that story.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Totally. I mean, this is so great for me to talk to you because you know, just the small workaround that you mentioned about the GUID is something that you're just doing a Docker I don't know, Docker PS, for example, and now all of a sudden you have a lot of noise. Same for Git as well. If you're doing a Git log, so there's a ton of stuff that when you are using a screen reader, and this might be important for the listeners to understand that it's true that we prefer text, but it still comes with challenges sometimes. And you were mentioning about the, having the common knowledge of, okay, if it's a CLI, you should be good to go. Well, it depends because there's TUI, there's a Go popular package these days that the Charm bracelet. That the bubble tea and things like that. So
Yes.
those are small component that you can use to build a very, very friendly and nice TUI application, terminal user interface. But those are generally not very friendly with screen readers.
Definitely. So that's a really good point about, and it is a common thing I hear as a question from folks. Oh, awesome. If you use the terminal, then any terminal app, any sort of TUI, as they call it, text user interface in the terminal, or no matter what it is, should be good to go, right? Question mark, because it's in the terminal and you can technically see the text. And to your point, that's not always the case. Maybe there's an app that uses columns like we've been talking about that's pretty straightforward to kind of cut and chop up, but maybe there's something that shows a table, and if it's going to do that, it's probably going to make the table out of vertical bar characters and dashes and other characters to make the table, and it looks great visually, but it's a lot of noise. So let's say I'm looking at a table that has name and age, and I ignore the rows of the terminal output that are graphical characters only, which are just sort of irritating and in the way. Even if I'm reading across that table, I might have, Ivan vertical bar, a number vertical bar, Dominic vertical bar, a number vertical bar. It's distracting to ignore those noise characters, if you will. So another example of like you were talking about bubble tea and those kinds of things that really make terminal user interfaces pretty and cool, and hats off to them for the products that they make that sound very interesting. But from a screen reader perspective, you have these N-curses style user interfaces that you can use your arrow keys to move through a menu, and you can expand and contract things, and you can press enter. I'm not talking about the bubble tea stuff particularly, just in general. There's these UIs that are like GUIs that are living in the terminal, and those can be usable, but again, it's not nearly as helpful as it might seem. It's creating another more sort of noisy or distracting interface than helping. So another example of this that's really, really simple is there's a tree command, TREE, in Unix, and it shows the structure of a directory and all of the subdirectories. And it uses these sort of graphical text terminal characters to show arrows and other things. I don't even know exactly what it looks like, but it's representing the depth of files and directories in a tree. And listening to that, there's no way to know that a particular file or folder is 1 level or 2 levels or 3 levels deep. It's mostly just a bunch of noise. You can try to figure it out. Oh, if I hear this nonsense character 3 times, it probably means I'm this many levels deep, but it's very, very noisy. And so it's hard to use tools like that. One nice workaround that I didn't mention earlier when we were talking about chopping up output and such is that a lot of tools, especially in my years doing lots of Kubernetes related things, is that you can often get output from a tool like the AWS command line interface, for example. You can get output in JSON. So sometimes those tools directly support something like JSON path, where you can, with AWS CLI, you can do like, AWS EC2 describe instances -- output JSON, and then you can also do -- query, and you can create like a JSON path expression to say, I want to have you show me everything in the list, so all the instances, and then I only want you to show me the name, which is actually a tag, so you have to do some funny syntax there. Show me the name tag, and then show me the public IP address of the instance. So I have a ton of scripts that kind of attempt to get me the most useful information out of something like Amazon Web Services or Google Compute Cloud or Azure or whatever. And I've developed these over the years to help, again, pull out I just want to see all my EC2 instances, and I want the name, the public IP, the state, whether it's running, and the instance type. Something that you might quickly look at if you were going to the AWS console, which is relatively accessible. It's busy and there's a lot going on, but what if I just wanted to see that stuff in the command line? So a lot of tools you can use, a -o flag or an output modifier and get JSON. And if you're not able to specify a JSON path expression like I just described in the AWS command line, you can pipe it into the JQ command and get kind of familiar with how to use JQ syntax to similarly extract the pieces that you want. So it's another way. This is also very useful for logs if you're lucky enough to have structured logging. So instead of it being a line of text that represents the time and date and facility and all these things that come from logs, you can, if you have structured logging where those fields are represented in a JSON structure, you might be able to literally pipe that log output into JQ and pull out just the message field and look at all the messages and be able to much more quickly read through the things that happened, not the other metadata that you maybe don't care about.
Oh yeah, totally. It's a life-saving tool. I use it a lot. You were mentioning the AWS console that is, quote unquote, not so bad. Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. But yes, those kind of huge portal is generally hard. I did not even use Azure since I use a screen reader. I was using Microsoft Azure back in the days. I remember that it was pretty. I don't know how to say that, but it was pretty UI heavy, if I can say that, with lots of panels that opens on the sidebar and things like that, depending. So I wonder if I'm wondering now if it's accessible.
It's been a while since I've used that console, and I think they all are in a constant state of flux, and they go through changes. And lately, there's the Amazon Q thing, which is their AI. You can ask me questions and I'll tell you potentially incorrect answers about things that are AWS related thing. But it's in the beginning it was very bouncing sort of proverbially in your face, like, want to try Amazon Q? And I was like, no, I don't. I just want to do what I'm here to do. But those kinds of things can be distracting in general in web UIs. I don't know if we want to sort of jump to that as a topic and touch on it, or
I'd like to jump to a question before we do that. So writer Ross was asking if there's something that is not generally known that we would like to say. So I'm paraphrasing the question, but basically, anything that, well, I can insert that myself before you go. I think as someone that was legally blind all my life, I would say that you need to understand that blindness is not a binary thing. It's not like you are seeing something like everyone else or you don't. There's a lot of degrees in there. There's a lot of eye condition and things like that. People that are myself, I was lucky to see from my centered vision, but I've seen people that were not seeing anything from their center vision, so they really had to turn their heads to either to read or just to walk and things like that. So what I'm trying to say is that I don't believe that this is a generally known that you can still be blind and still see a little bit.
Right. There's degrees of all things, in fact. So to kind of build on that a little bit too, I think that not only are there degrees of vision and visual impairment and scenarios where you're able to see some things maybe in certain light, but not if it's darker and or at certain distances and that sort of thing. There's also, of course, variation in how someone two people who have the same rough degree of blindness or sight are going to prefer things or are going to be familiar with, just like 100 other things in the world. There's differences among humans. We touched on this a little bit, I think, in the last episode, that essentially everyone has their own perspective and works differently, and that I made a joke about meeting someone and their perspective of a blind person being from a movie, or a book or something, and whether that was an accurate portrayal or not of the person who was blind in media. There's also differences in how all of us approach things. There's a lot of common stereotypes that you might run into, like, oh, you can't see here, do you want to feel my face? It's a fun one, for example. All right. And for me, for my vote, I'm like, no, not really. Yeah. That's sort of awkward and strange, and we just met, and it doesn't necessarily tell me a lot about a person, and it's not the perspective that I have. I happen to never have sight, and so while it's interesting to sometimes know aspects of what people look like, it's not going to unfold in that way. Like, I meet you on the street and I start feeling your face right away. I think another answer to that same question, what would you like folks to know that's not generally known, is that, again, generally, this isn't going to be true for every human because we're all different, but it's possible to do a lot of really amazing, interesting, cool stuff with our other senses. So I think that this is a thing that is developed, and I think I happen to have developed it at an early age, when admittedly I think it's easier for us to learn as people when we're young and our brains are in a different kind of more plastic state, meaning more pliable, more, we can adapt and soak in information and at a much higher rate. But I have always been blind, and so I happen to develop some much more attuned ability to determine things by what I hear around me. Right. And this could include, as an easy example, depth perception, walking through a room and knowing how close you are to things based on sound bouncing off of all sorts of stuff. It's why, like today, I have allergies because things are warming up and everything's blooming and my ears happen to be a little bit full, and it makes a difference. It has an impact these days on my depth perception, for example. So that's an example of the senses thing, but I don't think it's a given. Like some people have said, oh, you're blind, you must have amazing hearing. And my response to that is not necessarily, but possibly. I know a lot of blind people who have been blind for most of their life that don't necessarily have this ability. Why is that? I don't know. That's up to them. Maybe they never knew what was possible. Maybe they just are set up with a different biology in their hearing. I have no idea, truly, right? So, but to say you can do a lot with your other senses, and I do think that as humans we adapt, we grow our abilities in some of these other senses, we pay more attention to them, and we start listening in different ways, and I think that can go a long way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, totally. So let's jump to another question. So Rowan was asking about our opinion about AI, if it's going to help or maybe not, based on the fact that there is so many content that AI is capable of generating. Um, do you have any opinion about that? Is that something that you have thought about a little bit? Are you using AI yourself in your day-to-day work and things like that?
Not a lot. I do remember we touched on this a bit around some of the image
Yeah.
processing stuff.
Yeah,
and all
but
that.
this question is more about the amount of content that could be created. So because I can imagine that the question is, if it gets really noisy everywhere, how would that impact a screen reader user potentially? I this is what I'm understanding. I'm not sure if it's correct or not, but I don't think it could have an impact. I think it will have an impact on everyone. Now the content will probably be more diluted all around us, and you know I don't believe it will impact blind people more than everyone else.
Yeah, when I think about from a noise perspective, essentially, I think that AI as generators is going to generally speed how things can be produced, and therefore you could look at it creating more. That there's more things out there. Let's make up, for example, AI generating blog posts that could mean that there's more blog posts in the world, right? Although maybe it's echo chamber of blog posts based on blog posts, and then they all start looking the same. But we'll try to stay out of that. So if it's generating more blog posts and more blog posts, sure, there's more content in general, and it's more like saturated, I guess is the word I'll use. But from that perspective, I don't feel like it connects a lot to accessibility in terms of I still have a choice to consume the thing or not. If it generates, let's say, things that are more long form, I guess that could be a thing. But I don't see that being necessarily the fault of AI, unless it's AI amplifying something that already is. Like, oh, there's already a lot of long form content, and now AI is making more long form content. Which AI is definitely verbose, right? You ask AI about something, and AI does this funny thing where it sort of repeats back all the stuff. I can see how you want to know about X, Y, and Z and all the things that you just said that I'm repeating to you now in my response. And you're like, man, get to it, AI. Just give me my answer. So from a usability perspective, yeah, there's a little bit of that, but I don't feel a strong connection to what AI generates as it relates to accessibility. And I think we're too early, right? I think let's go a few more cycles and then see what we're getting.
Yeah. I want to jump to another question because last time we did not. So I want to pass the question. So maybe we will jump on different topic after that.
Yeah.
So Dustin Leblanc, or LeBlanc, it depends if you are. But I will say Leblanc because it's a French name. But wants to know about why I was saying that Go is one of the most accessible language. And also, what makes a programming language accessible? So myself, I was interviewed at Go Time Podcast at some point. I was starting to use a screen reader back then, so I was still in my early transition, and for me, I think Go is just the right amount of. How can I say that? The amount of symbols that the language does not have, with the simplicity of its syntax, makes it very accessible. So let me explain that. So I was a huge fan of Elixir. Elixir has a lot of data structure that they are using, person sign with brace and things like that. And there's there's a lot of small symbols that turns out, well, I found them distracting or noisy when I'm reading code. And that to me is what makes a language accessible. Basically, it boils down to how easy will the screen reader will be able to read me that code. I don't know if you have some takes about that.
Yeah, I agree. I sort of think of this as you put it much better, kind of with the symbols and aspect of it all. I think of it as lots of super meaningful punctuation. It's of course doable. Perl has a lot of this special, magical,
right?
dollar greater than, dollar less than, all the things, dollar at sign. And one important thing to mention that helps, I think, connect the dots for people listening to this that don't use screen readers is that typically when we're using a screen reader, we have some filtered version of punctuation feedback turned on, right? So we are not hearing every period, comma, and semicolon or colon or dollar sign necessarily. There's a filter of sorts, and it's not super configurable necessarily, at least not with Mac Apple VoiceOver, but there's usually 3 modes, all, some, or none. So that's what you get.
Right.
So the point there is that if there's a question mark, for example, like Rust has this question mark, and I'm not a big Rust guy. I've played with it some, but I know there's this sort of unwrap a result, expose me to the inner value of a thing that just happened, and whether or not to do that, if there's an error, is this determination that's made by this question mark operator. I did a horrible job of explaining that, but who cares? So if you're reading code and there's a question mark at the end of a statement, maybe you're going to get a little bit of a feedback from a sentence uplilt perspective from the screen reader. It might say X equals Y, like that. Yeah. And so you might be lucky to pick that up. But those kinds of use of symbology, like you described, I agree. It's nice that Go doesn't have a lot of that. The language is, I guess I'd say, relatively straightforward as a language definition, which is something that is a positive for me. I appreciate that as well. Another factor I think is that because there's Go FMT or Go Thumped, depending on what you like to say, I like that I don't have to care while I'm writing code necessarily about being exact with respect to my indenting.
Yeah.
The language doesn't care about indenting. It's not Python in that respect. So if I don't indent something, I'm not going to break whether my if statement works. Although I have a thing I use these days to help me do that, especially for YAML, but in Vim. But I don't have to care about the indenting, but I can still have nice code at the end of the day by passing it through Go FMT. And so that helps me provide code that looks good for my colleagues who can see, but not have to be concerned or distracted while I'm writing it with that. So
yeah, totally. The formatters are really great. I was an heavy user of tabs way longer before I used screen reader. Now these days I'm so happy I did that all my life. To me, indenting with tabs is so much easier when you are reading code with the screen reader, because it just is just one character to move to the next indentation. So it's easier for me to know, okay, this block is to indentation, for example. And like you said, with NVDA, I don't know if you have that with VoiceOver. I'm not completely there yet, but there's a way to configure different, I don't know, configuration. Let's say configuration based on a typical application. So my code editor could have a settings that says, read me all of the punctuation, and everything else isn't, for example, like the browser, because you don't want to be on the internet and now it calls out all the parentheses and everything. I'm still not there though. in terms of being able to, I don't know, it's so verbose when you turn on all the symbols, especially at some speed. It's pretty difficult for me at the moment. I think I'm still not used enough with my screen reader and things like that.
Right.
And I'm trying to go fast. I'm trying to have the speech, being fast. Although, when I'm hearing, probably I don't know about you, but I suppose that your speech should be pretty fast, and I'd like to reach that point at some point, but it's very difficult.
To the point of having all the punctuation turned on, I certainly only do that for small amounts of time. I don't read through a whole code base with that turned on, or look at. There's just too much punctuation. Even my shell prompt has punctuation I don't want to hear every single time.
Yeah.
And to your point of screen reader settings that let you turn those modes on for particular apps, that is a thing you can do. You can differentiate that in VoiceOver. But if my editor is in my terminal, then the app I'm in is my terminal. And so that means other tabs of my terminal and other things. It's either punctuation for all terminal things or not. And that's not granular enough. So if I used an editor like VS Code or Mac Vim that was its own app, which I don't, I just use Vim in the terminal today, but then I could probably differentiate, and that might be somewhat useful. But I'll usually turn punctuation feedback on when I need to confirm that I'm not missing a quote is the most common example. So I'm doing a JSON or something, and I just manually wrote a bunch of JSON really quick, and I want to make sure that I didn't insert text to the right of two quotes that were together instead of in between the quotes or something like that. So I'll turn it on to confirm that and then turn it back off. But like you, I don't want to hear that all the time. It's just too much. Yeah.
Those are the small things that if those episodes that we are recording makes people realize that just exactly what you said. So, it might sound strange for people to hear, typing text outside of the two quotes, for example, but it happens so frequently. I mean, this is the kind of things that is not, it never happens to sighted programmer for sure. And there's a lot of things like that. And my prompt, my bash prompt is just $. I was a huge user before that, having when I'm on a Git repo to have the branch and things like that, and all the current path and things like that. But that things get repeated all over the place, so I change it, and it's just $sign now.
Yeah, mine does have my Git branch in the prompt, so that when I'm very often in a repository working on some Terraform, for example. And the branch really matters to me because I'm switching contexts a lot. I'm doing a thing in a different branch now, and then I'm switching back to what I was doing, and I'm reviewing a merge request or a pull request, and that makes me go to yet another branch. And so I really want to be able to know what branch I'm on often enough. Now, I don't care what color it is. A lot of the prompt engineering, has this is red, that's blue, and the various control characters in there. And I just want the word main or whatever. And I do have that, but I don't have a lot. Oh, and I have the last component of my working directory also in the prompt, so that I can know where I am in the file system. So those are the only two things that I happen to have in my prompt. But I agree.
That's fascinating. So you mentioned pull requests. Now I'm a little bit curious. So this aspect is I find it a little bit more difficult now that I'm using a screen reader. Let me explain my issue, and maybe you can talk about how you do stuff. So before I used a screen reader, I was kind of lucky enough to be able to use the built-in GitHub pull request review where
in the web UI.
Yeah, in the web UI. They did a fantastic job for that. But I am not able to use that efficiently with my screen reader now. So I started to panic a little bit because, I mean, let's be real. Pull request reviewing is part of the job, right? It's still something that you need to do. I started to look around. The best thing that I have so far is that in VS Code, and we touched a little bit about VS Code. I think VS Code is so great at accessibility. So they have this extension called, I don't know exactly, GitHub issues and pull request extension, probably something like that. Mm-hmm. And they have a diff view in there that is, you can just hit a shortcut key. I think it's Alt F2, and now boom, the normal diff view of VS Code is now accessible, and I like it a lot. So instead of it really turns the diff into text. So like you were, like you could imagine. So let's say because usually you have on the left and on the right the two version and things like that. When you are using a screen reader, you prefer to have everything into one place. So now the diff shows the two version in, and you can navigate as usual, and even with the virtual keyboard of the screen reader. So now you can quickly jump around quickly to the next change, review the two line that change exactly, and it's pretty clear. So yeah, it really I think filled the gap that the UI was making for me. So how are you reviewing pull requests?
Yeah, so admittedly, it's been a little bit since I've done a lot of pull request reviews in GitHub. I do a lot in GitLab these days, and so my near perspective is a bit heavy on that side, but I can speak to them both and generally. So the UI, as you say, is not great for certain complexity of pull request or pull requests that are a lot of nuance and that kind of thing. I've certainly used both the GitHub and GitLab UIs to review pull requests that are relatively small, and it's not too bad. The diffs still show a plus or a minus sign for new or removed lines. And so if I kind of know from the description or talking to a colleague, oh, this pull request is just changing a quick value in this area, I can pull it up in the UI, and I'll often use my screen reader search. So this is not like Control F or Command F in a browser, but like actually have the screen reader find text for me and then move that aforementioned on the previous episode screen reader review cursor to that area. I'll often search for plus or plus in a space and find the new line. But that's making some assumptions, and so it's potentially dangerous, but I use it in those limited cases like I described. What I typically do for bigger and more involved pull requests is check out the branch locally and use Git. And I don't recall if there is a GitHub command line tool that helps you kind of wrap some common Git commands, but also helps you like talk to GitHub. And there's a similar one for GitLab, and it's called glab. And that one has a glab mrdiff command, which is not super special necessarily, but it saves you a little bit of time, and it's not very configurable. It doesn't let you, for example, ignore white space as near as I can tell in diffs. So you sort of get what you get, but what's nice about it is it's automatically going to show you the diff from what the pull request or merge request is based on. And sometimes that's hard to figure out a little bit in Git, depending on how many times the author has like merged main or master back into the feature branch and those kinds of things. It's doable, right? It just takes extra steps. So a few things that help me use Git to navigate without any special tools are there's Git diff has a flag --word diff, and if you imagine two lines that have changed maybe only in one character or one word, and the lines are long. You have to do this mental holding of context while you read the old line and the new line that is shown in the diff. So if it's a very long line, it's reading the old line and you're not exactly sure what you're looking for because you don't know what's changed, because that's the whole point of why you're looking at the diff. And so you're sort of like holding it in your brain while it reads this long, very detailed thing. Maybe it's code, maybe it's a line from a README. And then you're hearing the new line and you're kind of doing this mental compare. It's a lot. It's a lot of cognitive load. So word diff puts, I think it's actually like square brackets. It puts square brackets around the words or the characters that are different. Now, this is a little weird to read if the lines that you're looking at also have a lot of brackets. So you have to sort of know, okay, the brackets that I'm seeing in this line are, these brackets are part of the text. Maybe it's a list represented in brackets in Terraform code or in YAML. You can specify a list all on one line by putting stuff in brackets. So you have to kind of still pick that out. But word diff is a lifesaver often when I've looked at two lines and said to myself, I don't even see what's different. They look, to me, very the same, and it's also a lot of noise. So that's one thing. I also use a lot of chopping up the differences and kind of what I mean by that is exploring the differences systematically in a repo. If you know the repo or you know the code or you're familiar with, okay, one of my colleagues has changed a bunch of Terraform here, and there's a bunch of modules that are included, and then there's like the root module where we're calling all the modules from. I want to kind of work my way in, drill down, if you will, into the changes. And so a lot of times what I'll do is I'll want to just know, if you think about how you would look at this visually from a UI, one of the first things we ask ourselves is, well, what did you even change? What files are even different? So sometimes I'll use git diff --name -only, which shows me literally the file names and not all of the things that have changed. So now I get to see, and my git diff command has to compare to the correct thing, right? I might be comparing to main, I might be comparing to the commit in the pull request that the PR is based on. So when I say git diff, keep in mind I'm diffing the right place, right? So --name -only will show me only the names of the files that were modified. If that list is really, really giant and I want to limit it to the directory I'm in, I'll say git diff name only space period, because you can specify a path, and that limits what the diff represents as well. So using some of these git command line abilities, you can kind of slice and dice, looking at only the things that you want to look at, just like you would in a web UI. Let me see what files have changed first. Okay, I'm going to look at the top level files first and see what we're doing there. All right, now let's look at the first Terraform module that got modified and what's changed in there. And sometimes I'll git diff a specific file because I'm examining the changes from the purview of my familiarity with the thing that we're looking at, the pile of code. Yeah. So it would be a lot harder for me to do that in a UI. It's possible, but you're dealing with kind of the noise that might exist in the web UI. Or if I can pick on GitLab for a second, one thing that happens to me in the GitLab UI, because sometimes you do have to go in the UI if you want to comment on a file, and you can do that from the command line tools, and I do sometimes, but sometimes it's easier for me to just find the line in the UI, go to the left of that line, and there's a button to add a comment. But in the GitLab UI, there's this thing that happens where, let's say there's 30 files that have changed. As you start doing stuff in the UI, as near I can tell, the list of files, which you can expand and contract each file, and then the changes that have been made in each file, that list kind of seems to move up and down on a sliding scale within the actual web page, and seems to be movable in a way that I can't quite discern or find on my own with a screen reader. And I've never reached out to GitLab, to be fair, about this. I need to. So if anyone is hearing this and you work with GitLab, apologies that I'm talking some smack about your UI, and I should get in touch with you and have a conversation. So I will do that. But what happens is the list of files that have been modified kind of slides up and down at will, like when it wants to. And so sometimes I am looking at a file in the UI that's changed, and then I come back and that file is just gone. It's just not showing up ever in the list. And so there are things like that make it more challenging to find the thing that I know has changed so that I can then add a comment. So I think that's most of the answer. Essentially just locally checking out the branch and using word diff and using git to help you chop the pull request up into composable chunks.
Yeah, I will have to use the dash that word. I never used that.
So. Word diff is so amazing.
Yeah, it seems to be great. But to return to the VS Code extension, you can read the comments as well and post comments from the extension as well.
Oh, nice.
So yeah, okay. I know. I keep returning to VS Code is great. I
need to try VS Code again. I think.
Yeah. And it's all about all the smoothness that comes with LSPs that are they really makes a huge difference. We were talking off record about the and now I have a blank. the information that you can pull from a function, for example, and things like that. So you can access the quick information. The same thing that people are using when they are mousing over. Mm-hmm. That when I discovered that, it's Control K I think the shortcut, and it automatically brings you all the documentation. And with Go as well, another reason why I really, really like Go is that all the documentation is just easily accessible whenever you want it to, as you are writing the code. So at first I was using GoDoc on the command line, to check packages, or the documentation website as well is pretty solid, accessibility wise and things like that. I know I have said the contrary on my Go Time interview, but now it's good. But the bottom line is that everything is now accessible from VS Code, and they put the effort of making all of those small pop-ups accessible. So you were asking if it was distracting. Well, it's not distracting at all, because you drive when this thing appears, and you decide if you want to go inside that thing in an accessible way or not. So you still have to press, again, the Alt F2 keystroke, and now you are in that small pop-up window with your virtual keyboard navigation, and you can read the documentation. You can see the parameter, the types, the return types, because that is something. The return types is not announced. So let's say I'm writing Go and I do an HTTP handler and whatever. So the parameters that needs to fulfill this function will be announced, but not the return type. So if I'm calling a function that do return something, well, in a screen reader, you never know what this thing is returning. So you need a way to know what it returns. So those small keyboard shortcuts are really helpful to either bring up the over message to now access the return type, or just the documentation itself. So to me, those are the small things that makes my life a little bit easier, because it's pretty hard. And when you were mentioning about the search of the screen reader, so when you are browsing a page, it took me a long time to understand, or at least to discover, that my screen reader had a search capabilities, because I was doing the Control F. I've been doing Control F all my life.
Right.
And now my virtual cursor was not moving to that place. I was like, how does people do that? So yeah, it's all the small things that makes you, just your day is a little bit easier with when the tooling helps you.
For sure. And on the VS Code perspective, how is it when it might want to make a suggestion, which I know is a thing it can do a lot? You are starting to type a function name and you can autocomplete that. Is that a feature that you use, and is it too chatty for you?
It's a little bit chatty. I've opened an issue as well with Microsoft because not only it's announcing. So while you are typing, there's a small pop-up that opens. So people usually use their arrow to. It's a drop down, for example. You know, the issue that I have is that with the screen reader, it sometimes speak not only the function, but it will start with the current application, the current project, the current file. And things like that.
So the build up is a lot of yes.
This makes me crazy. I recorded a video because I opened an issue with Microsoft and they closed it because they were not able to replicate. I recorded a video showing the issues and now they reopened it. But again, I don't know. This is something. So to me, where I am in my life at the moment, the things that I want to do in mid and long terms, contribute to NVDA and probably contribute to anything that I'm using myself and just try to, I don't know, just try to fix my problem, because we had a question last time we recorded, you know, what jobs are easy and things like that. It's not really about jobs. It's just, well, to me at least, it relates to, can I use the tools that I'm used to use that I know works great? I was trying to read email from a Microsoft Outlook web the other day, and the screen readers kept failing. You know, the browser was I was going down trying to read the next email. It was taking like 15 seconds. Those things are not working for me.
Yeah, I definitely, I sometimes will use the native, you know, Google or back in the day, Outlook Web Access interface, but mostly I connect, in my case, Apple Mail,
right,
or Apple Calendar to the Google or Microsoft backend so that I can use the native app to do the things that I want to do, and it's more straightforward. And similarly to your point of using the tools, all the tools that we might encounter that are beyond sort of the reading and writing of code, absolutely there are learning curves to muscle memory that we get used to using a particular web UI or whatnot. And of course, those interfaces change over time. We were talking about the AWS console as a quick past example, right? If you need to go into the AWS console for something, as much of a command line person as I am, I still go into the AWS console often, because one thing that happens is the AWS console gives you some workflows sometimes that to reproduce them on your own through a command line tool or a series of API calls would be a lot more work. So let's say you are using AWS simple email service and you want to enable your AWS account for quote unquote production access, which means you're out of the AWS SES sandbox, which means you can send more emails than you would normally be able to send per unit of time. The way you do that is you go through a wizard, and essentially it ends up opening an AWS support case for you. But you have to sort of use that wizard screen to initiate the support case and put it in the right category. And could you do that with a command line interface and open a support case and maybe get close? Yes. Would it reach the same team with the sort of, you know, potential magic tags that get set on the support case by going through the wizard? I have no idea. So there are things like that I do in the traditional UI because I want the same outcome. I want the same experience. And this is a classic example of when I have used command line interface versus some kind of UI on, let's say, a storage array or a fiber channel switch that you plug servers in and storage arrays into so they can all talk to each other over fiber channel. There's often a big difference between the workflows or the UX in a command line interface compared to what you get in a GUI.
Yeah.
And there are some cases where that hasn't been the case, like certain vendors have had amazing parity in their command line interfaces that are just like the workflows you would have, let's say, getting started, going through a getting started type wizard to setting something up and it walking you through reasonable steps to four buckets of things you should do if you want to get rolling quickly with your new thing. And they reflect that in the command line interface as well. But often that's not the case. Often the command line interface gives you access to a bunch of stuff. But if you don't know how a system works yet, because it's new to you, it's even worse to learn how does this storage array work? What's the terminology that we use? And how do we set things up and in a reasonable way? And I'm reading documentation that's very GUI centered. And if I'm not going to be able to use the GUI, maybe it's a Java app that isn't written with accessible frameworks and it's an empty window. So now I have to use the command line interface. There might be a lot of magic or helpful wizardry that the GUI does for me to help glue things together in a getting started kind of way that might not be exposed in the command line interface. And so it's a lot of work, but I got good at learning the concepts, reading what we do in the GUI, and then piecing together the four things I have to do in the command line interface to equate to the one thing that somebody clicks on four things in the GUI and they're done. So kind of a long, somewhat rambly way of saying that sometimes that is the case, and sometimes we have to sort of go the long way around or use the use the command line interface or even make API calls to something. Yep. And it can be tiring, but it's also how I've accomplished a lot in my past configuring things in data centers.
Sure. Oh yeah, it's not only RTFM. You need to read the manual a lot when you are dealing with accessibility issues and things like that. You need to figure out a lot of stuff. This is a great segment. Andy Williams from the Find Toolkit was asking about what is the most impactful tools that that exist for GUI or CLIs basically. Because I think it rejoin what you just said a little bit. I would expect.
Yeah, I think most impactful accessibility tools, if we're looking at GUIs, using standard UI controls or using controls for the thing that they're made to represent, it goes a long way. So an easy example I'll give to help make my point is, for years, HTML used tables as a layout mechanism, right? Not as I actually mean for this to be a table. Somebody would use a table to nudge text over to the right or whatnot, whatever. And so if you were using a screen reader to look at a web page or a web UI, there'd be these tables that were there as a layout mechanism, not as an actual tabular representation of data. So that's an easy sort of thing I can point to sort of highlight the point of what I'm trying to say when I say use standard UI controls. Apple has, I would say, a higher chance of native apps being accessible because folks use a checkbox when they want a checkbox, they use an edit field when they want to use an edit field, or they make it multi-line if they need to, etc. And those UI controls have accessibility bindings so that
Yeah.
a screen reader can activate those controls in a reasonable way. And so I'm not going to say it's impossible to make an inaccessible iOS app, because for sure it is, but generally if you're using those standard controls, you're going to have your app be more accessible than not. When we start running into problems is when somebody maybe hacks up their own UI control. So let's say they want a checkbox, but they want it to look cool and new age and something. And so it visually looks and functions like a checkbox, but it might be something that to us in a screen reader literally looks like a button. And it...
Well, if we are lucky.
Right. And so that might mean that I can see that there is a control, but it doesn't mean that it shows that it's a checkbox. And it also doesn't mean, therefore, that I can see whether it's checked.
Yeah.
So there are some workarounds that help, which help you to be a little less angry using these user interfaces. You know, iPhone has a thing where you can use screen recognition. So if I turn that on, it's helping to kind of recognize the screen beyond using the normal screen reader UI control mechanisms. And so sometimes that screen recognition mode will help me see, oh, these button things are checkboxes. But sometimes it still can't tell whether those are enabled or not. And examples, you know, the Unify networking gear, you know, there's a controller that you can run locally, and there's a web UI for that. And a lot of those controls are this way, where you don't really know what you're getting. And you can come closer by having someone sighted look at the UI with you, and you can sort of know, okay, when I go into this particular screen, this is the state that everything is in. If I'm creating a new wireless SID, and all these things are unchecked by default. So I might not be able to tell if they're checked, but I know they start out unchecked. And if I ever click it, it checks it. And if I ever lose track of what I've done, I should click cancel and start over. So these are examples of the kind of workarounds that we do because we want to be able to use a thing. You know, back to Andy's question, there's a lot of HTML view kind of apps that are sort of like web apps, but they're local, right? And they can work, but it requires some translation. It's like learning a web UI, of course, because it basically is. So I'll use VS Code as an example a little bit here. So because VS Code is written in a way that is usable across lots of operating systems, if I go to open a file in VS Code, I don't get my native operating system file open dialog, at least the last time I checked. I get this like sort of webby version of a file open dialog. And it's interesting to realize in that situation how much I'm used to the native file open or save as dialog, because it's what I see all day long in my operating system. Now all of a sudden, maybe my shortcut keys don't work to jump quickly between like common folders, or like in Mac OS, I'm opening a file, I can hit Shift Command G and it pops up a box where I can type in ~path to a folder and press enter, and then my view is jumped to that area. You know, I'm not saying I don't get that in VS Code, but as an example, if it's not the native dialog, it now requires sort of, you know, special behavior for your app. And I understand that the trade-off is your app is usable in Mac and Windows and Linux, and I get how that's valuable. But from a screen reader UI perspective, it requires me to learn and do some translation.
Oh yeah, totally. There's a lot of application. Let's just take the Z editor as well, which is, you know, winning in popularity and things like that. But they are using a GPU rendered UI, so it's completely inaccessible. They have an issue. You know, they will probably work on that at some point, but at this point, it's totally not usable. And I was talking with Andy Williams, but he's the creator of the Find Toolkit, and it's the same thing. So basically, Find all the controls and widgets and things like that are all custom drawn from the GPU and things like that. So at some point, there's a very, very nice Rust package or library that is coming up, which is called AccessKit. And this is exactly for that, to help, I would say, GUI library to be accessible cross-platform, so Windows, Mac, and Linux. So the AccessKit Rust library is kind of a layer on top of all the accessibility differences of all the OSs. And now the GUI library just would talk with AccessKit to say, you know what, this is the state of the view at the moment. But it's not. There's nothing for Go at this point. So the Find toolkit is probably waiting for that.
And to use AccessKit as an example, I wonder, are they doing some sort of like Swift bindings to actually like tie into UI kit to make those UI controls? Like, are they actual native UI controls, or are they doing something else to?
No, they are talking directly to the accessibility processing of the OS. So it's okay. They are not redoing any controls. They are just saying, okay, you know what? On Windows, it's the
they're providing all the metadata to say you can't see this control, but I'm going to make it appear that you can operate with it and tell you all the things about it's a checkbox or
exactly. Because at the end of the day, the YUA DLL in Windows, you can send that a bunch of information, and it will just act as the normal button, the normal Windows button, for example, or a text box and things like that. Right. So yeah, but we are still a little bit far from there, and it's a little bit involving. I started to check it myself because at some point I was interested, and as a blind user, I was kind of interested to build something and find that would be accessible. But I mean, the amount of knowledge that I don't possess. Talking with Mac and Linux and Windows about accessibility is a huge take. So that's why the AccessKit library is such a great it's a great thing. I think the one of the person that is working on that was working on accessibility at Microsoft, and it's pretty. It's extremely interesting, but I mean, like everything else, it just takes time to build those things. So hopefully that answers the question. So last question that I had was from Marcus Wistenberg, was asking about what can he do to make his library or packages more accessible. I would say there's not much that you can do other than providing the standard documentation and things like that. Just ensuring that if you are going to have a documentation website that is outside of the language, if you can ensure that this custom documentation website is accessible, I mean, there's probably not much else you can do, but maybe you have some thoughts.
I'll reference this. We talked about this last time, but it applies well to this question, which is essentially don't only rely on diagrams or infographics to explain key concept or especially for getting started. So what I essentially said the last time about this was that I understand how this is useful to have diagrams, and it helps for people that are visual learners and they can parse that. But having a description of those relationships, while I recognize that it requires effort and lots of time to create something eloquent that describes, and it's probably going to be long, and that's okay, because what do they say? A picture's worth 1,000 words. So there you go, 1,000 words. But that really goes a long way to not only people that are blind, but maybe someone's dyslexic or someone's colorblind or someone is just having a hard time grasping. They're not a visual learner, quote unquote. And so that's one piece. And then similar to the Unix tree command, Sometimes I've seen web pages include text, but it's text like the tree example that we talked about earlier, where it's technically there's text on the screen that I can read, but I don't have the referential integrity because I can't see what relates to another thing. So just because it's text, but it's a graphical representation, the same problem still exists there. Your point about documentation, I agree. If you're going to write, whether it's in your README on GitHub or another doc site, using typical like accessible aids to websites is important here. So using headings and levels of headings to represent your sections, because we can jump by heading and by the same level of heading or a different level of heading, and that really helps us jump around. Also, when you link to something, if you're going to link to a reference, instead of saying, if you want to learn more about this, go here, and then the word here is linked. While this isn't a common thing that I do, a lot of people commonly will jump by link looking through a page. And so it's better if your link refers as a more complete thought to the thing that you're linking. So you might, to use my earlier example, say, if you want to find out more information about that, check out, and then the link might be the documentation for the blah, blah, blah. So now if I only read that link as a standalone piece of text, I know what the link refers to. So those are two quick ones about the headings and have your link text be descriptive. It helps people navigate. The headings thing is really big. You know, it's easy to jump to a heading level 1 or a heading level 2 on a new page, and I can skip past whatever boilerplate exists. Navigation, sub-navigation. I've never been a big fan of the links at the top of pages that say, like, you know, click here to skip past all the noise, because now I have a new click in my browser history that, like, every page has 2 places in my history that I have to, if I'm going to go back, that I have to go traverse. But that's just me. So the headings go a long way, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's so easy. I think there's no excuses to have a bare minimum accessible page. I would say the landscape as well. You know, just naming your main navigation, sub navigation, and your main. Just having that, the header, of course. And also, I would just say, if you are going to repeat anything, you know, have an header there as well, or have something that lets us just go to the next item. If it's not a UI, a list item, if it's like a div that is repeated all over the place, we still need a good way. I'm referring to Reddit comment, for example. There's no easy way to jump to the next comment, and this is sad.
So, you know what I tend to do for that, and maybe I'm missing something here, but I don't think this is causing me to miss any content, is I, with my screen reader, search for the word metadata on Reddit. And so, because before the text of every comment, there's a thing that's like an expandable control that says metadata for Ivan's comment. And then right below that is the actual text of my comment. And so it's a textual anchor that I use to search for those words. And when I'm tired of reading, you know, one guy's soapbox, I'll just search for the word metadata and find the next comment. And it's a very nice way of navigating me through that way. In lieu of, like you say, a heading or a control, or sometimes there is a heading in general on other sites. Sometimes there is a heading that represents everybody's comment, but there's still a lot of mess to read through from that heading to the actual meat of the comment. GitHub is kind of a good example of this, right?
Yeah.
Every comment has a heading, but you still have the author information and all that kind of stuff. And then if you like traverse the author name half the time, it triggers a pop-up button that wants to show you a modal, and then you hit escape. So there's all these things that are just natural kind of irritating byproducts of using a system that you get used to. And there are some days where I don't have it in me as much to sort of like, I guess I'll put this another way. The cognitive load of dealing with those workarounds is more noticeable, right?
Yeah.
If it's a day that there's more going on in the world, or I didn't get good sleep or whatever, you notice, you feel that you can't just go use a site effortlessly. You're doing all these workarounds. And so it certainly is noticeable, and it's hard to coach folks on exactly how to improve this, because I really have empathy for they're just making their site. Like my GitHub example of moving over an author name triggering a pop-up.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes that's a complicated problem to solve because it depends on the framework they've used to implement that and why is it happening. Sometimes I can get rid of that stuff by telling my screen reader to stop moving the mouse to follow my screen reader cursor. Like that's a big win. To keeping things from expanding as though by themselves. Also, I digress some more about sometimes you're on a site and the site wants to tell you something that it thinks is important, and it essentially forces the screen reader to verbalize something that you might not care about at all. And sometimes that might be, something went wrong on some random website that you're on. And I don't know what that is. I can't help you. I don't care. In Apple VoiceOver, there's a setting in the web category called live regions, which essentially means let me update and speak stuff that happened in the web page. And sometimes you just have to turn live regions off for a little while and have a better life. I don't know what that might be called in NVDA or other JAWS or whatever, but sometimes turning off live regions is necessary because sometimes it'll even happen in other tabs. I'll have like a GitLab tab open and I'm not even in the GitLab tab and it's telling me stuff. So yeah, this is, it would be interesting to, like you said about knowing more things. I don't feel very equipped to know how to instruct, let's say, web designers on, I know HTML and a little bit about divs and CSS and labels on controls, but I'm not a front end developer. I don't have that knowledge, and so I feel like I should learn more about that kind of stuff so that I can speak the language well and eloquently to be able to help describe to others. Not only is this thing happening in a way that's kind of painful, and I can show it to you in a video with audio, but also I surmise that maybe this is the thing that's actually in play, and here's how to fix it. So
yeah, totally.
In any spare time that I might have, I feel like I should become more adept at that stuff.
Yeah, totally. It's a challenge. Although I will say that to me, web is still the best place to be compared to a lot of, I don't know, GUI stuff. I find it more difficult on native GUI. Let's say the Windows control panel, for example, and any settings, anything. I don't know. It's just the web is more. I like it. I like it because we can just go from the top to the bottom, and we have lots of control that you don't necessarily have elsewhere. So yes, but again, I mean, it's a battle. This is what I wanted to transpile from those recording. I mean, this is what I feel as well after, I don't know, 3 years, maybe more, using a screen reader. It's a daily battle, and there's mostly always something new. That's why I'm not a huge fan of. I tend to, well, for now at least, just stay in things that I'm comfortable with, and I don't really have energy at the moment to I don't know, to fight. It's just a constant fight.
Yes, and some days you have it in you to open a support ticket, and like my earlier example, I should talk to GitLab about their accessibility, and I will. Some days you have it in you to do that, and some days you don't. Yeah. And it's amazing all the things that we have access to today. The things, the folks have put an incredible amount of energy into screen readers and UI frameworks and access bridges of various sorts between them, and to make things accessible. And I want to make sure that we're also clear. This is truly how I feel, that I'm grateful and I'm amazed by the things that we can do, and I'm the guy who's blind and doing it. At the same time, sometimes it feels like picking your way through a forest with lots of brambles and stuff, and sometimes it's a little bit much, depending on how much we're trying to do or what kind of day we're having, right? So it's an interesting problem to solve. The previous topic of looking at logs or tracing a request through a series of applications or serverless functions or whatever, those kinds of things are near impossible to do these days, depending on the details of what system are you trying to use to do the tracing and to look at the logs. I'd love to solve that problem. I have a few ideas of companies that I do plan to reach out to in 2025 to have conversations that I think are open to that. And I'm under no illusion that it's an easy problem to solve. And I also am very aware that there's a common question, why do we even care? Why should we be inclusive? Why should we have things be accessible? And besides it being the right thing to do, if you are a person that believes that, which I obviously do, I also understand that to a lot of companies, taking the money and time and effort and dev cycles away from product to make something accessible feels like it's not a win. And as one large company put it to me once, how many customers do you think we would get if we made this thing accessible?
Totally.
And sometimes that number might not be big enough for a company's bottom line. And while I don't like that from the perspective of a blind individual, I also get it. It makes me mad, but I get it from the business perspective of that company.
Yeah, I fully agree with you on that. But I will say that the minimum is not hard to reach. So I would expect today to have the minimum accessibility-wise, mostly everywhere. And it's not really the case yet. And I know there is some legislation in Europe or EU more specifically that is coming in June that will force organization to have the minimum done. And I think this is great because the minimum is not hard to do. It's just and I fully agree with what you just said, but there's no reason not to have just the strict minimum. And I'm guilty of not having. I've built some SaaS in my time, and they were not. They were not accessible. I'm guilty of doing that in the past, but I don't believe that today. If you take web framework like Tailwind, for example, which comes with a lot of great default in terms of accessibility and things like that. Well, I think we are on a good path to at least expect the minimum.
I agree. I think the bar could be higher for that minimum perspective for sure, and also to the point of helping complex things to be more accessible, like the logs or the tracing or looking at data over time series data examples.
Yeah.
One interesting thing that I'll say quickly as a segue about that is that often the conversations I find myself in with people who are very smart and capable and also work in these areas is how can we make graphs accessible to people? And one of the things that I think about a lot and will say is that graph is the delivery mechanism that is commonly used for people who are using their eyes to look at data. But let's think about what the graph is actually there to represent. And why do sighted people go to the graph? By the way, a lot of sighted people don't enjoy that graph is the vehicle for this, right? It's just what they have, so they grin and bear it. But it's interesting to think about, why do we go to the graph? Usually it's to see outliers and to see when trends change and so on and so forth. So, we can provide that perspective without making a graph accessible. Let's go back to what questions are we using the graph to answer, and let's just answer those questions in another place. Speaking of which, that's something that AI potentially could help with if we want, I guess, right? We have to let it see data, and how do we feel about that? But, what if I provide a pile of time series data and then I ask my AI something that normally a graph would attempt to tell me, like, when did this start to trend towards being full, this disk space, or this memory usage? Or when did this exhibit a new behavior in a small way that now 4 months later is noticeable, right? So that's, I think, the path to getting to observability, quote unquote, as the everyone is like now branding their stuff observability. It used to be monitoring, now it's observability. I think that's the path to getting observability to be more accessible, and I'd love to.
Yeah, I agree on
be
that.
part of it and see it happen.
Yeah, totally. All right. I mean, I think it's already more than 1 hour and 20 minutes. So, do you have any closing thoughts that things that you want to cover before we wrap up?
Just thank you to everybody who is still here and who is interested and who has posed questions to Dominic and to the podcast. I happen to be on a lot of the Slacks. If anybody would like to have more conversations about these sorts of things, I'm on the Gopher Slack, the Kubernetes, the CNCF Slack, and as my name is Ivan Fetch, I'm usually Ivan or Ivan Fetch. There are other Ivans on a lot of these Slacks, but you can hopefully find me there. And I'm always happy to be part of these conversations. And again, thank you for the invite, and thank you for the chat. And I look forward to, over time, we can have some more of these.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.